Okay, we're going to look at a different style of equation that you haven't really seen much before, at least in this class and under this light with dealing with graphing and solving. In all honesty, your approach to solving won't be much different than a simple substitution. We'll get into that when we're dealing with systems. But before we do the systems part of this, I want to address the type of graph that you'll see when you see an x times y equals 8. Let me also say that this kind of graph can be misleading in other ways that it can be written. It could also have been written as 8 over x, or x equals 8 over y. Notice that basically if you were to cross multiply, you would get xy equals 8. With that in mind, because I want you to be familiar with that, but with that in mind, our approach to how to graph it is very similar in how we've done every other one. But I want to look actually at just a table of values. And to start with, I want you to think about what multiplies to give us 8. Just easy numbers. And of course, my thoughts immediately run to 1 times 8, 2 times 4, 4 times 2, 8 times 1. It is also true we could have 1/2 or 1.5 or different values that would go in between each of these numbers. But for right now, let's stay away from the fractions and just follow that. So if I was to graph that, we'd have the point 1, 8. You'd have the point 2, 4. You'd have the point 4, 2, and you'd have the point 8, 1. And so maybe it's not quite so obvious. If I did the fractions, it certainly would be. But you would see this somewhat of an arc to it on that side. Now, what if instead I thought about -1? If x was -1, what would y be? Of course, it would have to be negative. And -2 times -4, and -4 times -2, and so on down the line. And so what you'd find is you'd have -1, -8, and -2, -4, and -4, -2, and -8. And so what you find is a similar arc on that side. Interesting. Well, let's scroll down here to x times y equals 16. In a similar fashion, let's kind of look at an xy table. 1 times 16, 2 times 8, 4 times 4, 8 times 2, 16 times 1. And as we would draw the graph, you would get 1, 16, and 2, 8, and 4, 4, and 8, 2, and so on. And so what do you notice? Yeah, another arc. And if I again slap the negatives on there, again, both negatives would put it in this section here. Do you notice some similarities? I hope so. Now let's look at the ones here on the right where they're negative. So I have xy equals -8 and xy equals -16. So let's just do a chart similar to what we did here before. So x times y. If I had 1, instead it would be -8, and 2 would be -4, and 4 would be -2, and 8 would be -1. So the difference simply would mean that instead of being in the first quadrant here, we'd be 1, -8, and 2, -4. In other words, it would appear here in the fourth quadrant. Similar, if I had these x values as negatives, and the y's would become positive, and so instead it would appear in the second quadrant. Now what do you expect with the xy equals -16? What I'd like for you to do is to construct another graph that would go with x times y equals -16. Think through that and what that looks like. And then what I'd like you to resolve is, what do you notice as a pattern? What would I expect that the kind of graph I would have then if I had x times y equals 24, or x times y equals -24? What would the graph look like in its most general sense? And therefore, we could make conclusions even so far as to say, what would happen if we have x times y equals some positive number and x times y equals some negative number. And I would like you to take it that far today in your lesson. This is what I would like you to come into class with. What do you notice as an observation within these graphs what could we observe every single time I have x times y? I have that inverse variation, is what that is. As one goes up, the other one would go down, and vice versa. As one goes down, the other one would go up. What kinds of graphs do we see occur with that when it's a positive number or a negative number? And for that, that's where I will leave you today, and I would like for you to come up with that for class tomorrow.